On March 5th, 1945, a unique unit of the Allied forces advances to the front line in Italy. They wear the same khaki uniforms and Brodie helmets as millions of other British and Commonwealth soldiers, but with one vital difference. Most of these men are Jews, and they proudly wear the Star of David on their shoulders. These men make history in more ways than one. Not only are they the first Jewish unit to see combat with the regular Allied forces, but they will soon be instrumental in the building of the State of Israel. I'm Spartacus Olsson. This is a World War II in real-time special on the Jewish Brigade. Of course, the men of the Jewish Brigade aren't the first Jews to fight in British battle dress. British Jews serve in a combat and non-combat role throughout the British Armed Forces. Their American, Australian, and Canadian counterparts do the same and have integrated many Jewish refugees from occupied Europe. And of course, the Red Army has by far the largest number of Jewish personnel. The difference is that the Jewish Brigade is the first explicitly Jewish unit consisting mainly of Jews from Palestine itself. But this deployment of about 5,000 men into battle has been far from simple. The creation of the unit is the culmination of a long struggle by Zionist organizations against the policies of the British government and against the sections of British Jewish opinion which have opposed the Jewish fighting unit as an obstacle to assimilation. So, how did we finally get here, and why has it taken so long? The Jewish Agency, which is the main Zionist organization in Palestine, had been urging the British government to create an all-Jewish military force since the outbreak of war in September 1939. Not only would such a unit be used to strike against the genocidal enemy of the Jews, but the Zionist leadership believed that the formation of such a unit, with its own flag and insignia, would demonstrate to the Palestinian Jewish community and the world that the Jewish homeland laid out in the 1917 Balfour Declaration is a de facto reality. Beyond that, training a force of young men as a professional army would only be useful in case of future conflict with the Arabs of the region. The formation of a Jewish fighting unit would also serve the Zionist movement in the creation of a new, stronger Jewish image. They want the image of the battle-ready, muscle Jew to act as a counterweight to the long-standing anti-Semitic stereotypes that exist of Eastern European Jews, stereotypes that the Nazis have exploited of Jews as combat-shy, physically weak, and exclusively devoted to intellectual activities. For years, however, those requests had been firmly opposed by the British authorities of Mandatory Palestine and the Colonial Office. A letter sent to the British Secretary of War, James Grigg, sets out the reasoning. It is purely a nationalist move, and it is a move that is entirely incompatible with the existing policy of the White Paper issued in 1939, which rests on the assumption that Palestinian Jews and Arabs are alike citizens of Palestine. Once we accept the principle of a Jewish army with a Jewish flag and Jewish badges, we accept the principle of a Jewish state. Palestinian Jews have been seen to serve in the British military, but they were limited to service in a mixed force of Jews and Arabs called the Palestine Regiment, formed in 1942. On paper, this is a combat-ready unit, but it lacks equipment and fighting potential. It will remain stationed in Palestine and will never face the enemy. This should all be seen in the context of the long saga of the 1920s and 30s during which the British agonized over the future of Mandatory Palestine. To cut a very long story very short, the British repeatedly flip-flopped and reneged on the future of Palestine. At various points they promised total Arab sovereignty, shared Jewish and Arab sovereignty, and partition into separate states. All this against the backdrop of ethno-religious violence in Palestine, rising anti-Semitism in Europe, and increasing Jewish immigration to Palestine. By the time that war broke out in Europe, the British position had settled. The 1939 White Paper nixed the previous 1937 policy of partition. Instead, Palestine was to become a single state with shared governance by Jews and Arabs. There would be limits on Jewish immigration and purchase of property in Arab lands. That white paper was rejected by both the Jews and the Arabs, but will be held as British government policy until the end of the mandate in 1948. At that point, the British will pass the problem on to the United Nations. If you'd like the more detailed version of events, Sebastian and I produced an hour-long video on the Time Ghost History channel. Link should be on the screen right now. In the end, it is the personal sympathies of Winston Churchill which opens the door to an all-Jewish unit. Churchill is a supporter of the Zionist cause. As colonial secretary in the early 1920s, he had advocated what he called the paramount pledge and obligation of establishing a Jewish national home in Palestine. He voted against the 1939 White Paper and its single-state solution, even though it had been introduced by his own conservative government. After years of lobbying by the Jewish Agency, he announces the creation of the Jewish Brigade to the House of Commons on September 28, 1944. I know there are vast numbers of Jews serving with our forces and the American forces throughout all armies, but it seems to me indeed appropriate that a special Jewish unit, a special unit of that race which has suffered indescribable torments from the Nazis, should be represented as a distinct formation among the forces gathered for their final overthrow. Churchill ensures that the unit should be deployed only against the Germans in Europe, not against the Japanese, that it should not be split up other than in emergencies, and he secures the King's permission for the unit to fly the blue and white Zionist flag with the Star of David. Recruitment begins, but despite the efforts of the Zionists in Palestine, it proves impossible to recruit enough Jews to form a full brigade of 5,000 men. There are a few reasons why this is the case. First, although there are some Jewish volunteers from Britain, British Jewry is on the whole hostile to Zionism at the moment. Most British Jews want to fight as British soldiers. Political divisions within the Jewish community in Palestine also play a part. Despite their opposition to British denial of a Jewish state and limits on Jewish immigration to Palestine in the context of the Holocaust, the majority of Orthodox Zionists have adopted a policy of collaboration with Britain to defeat Nazism. But there were those who have dissented. At the most extreme end of the spectrum, the underground Zionist paramilitary group Irgun have reopened their campaign of terror against British facilities in Palestine, declaring there is no longer any armistice between the Jewish people and the British administration in Eretz Israel, which hands our brothers over to Hitler. On the moderate end, Zionist leaders and future Israeli Prime Minister Ben-Gurion is cautious about sending a large number of young Jewish men to Europe. There is a need for young people in Palestine to help build the new nation and prepare for a possible war with the Arabs. Eventually, about 3,200 Palestinian Jews join up. They are men whose backgrounds reflect the centuries of persecution suffered by Jewish communities in Europe, for whom Palestine was often a life-saving refuge. The brigade's senior chaplain, Rabbi Bernard Kasper, a staunch Zionist, describes them as follows. Former refugees from Germany, men who had run away from Austria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania for fear of the descending Nazis. Early pioneers who had gone up to build the land, the Jewish state, 20 or 30 years ago from Russia and Poland. Romantic-looking, dark-skinned Yemenite Jews and black falashas from Abyssinia. These were the bulk of the 54 countries which were represented in the brigade, but which were now all welded into a new Palestinian spirit and tradition. The men may be united in their ambitions, but tensions within the Zionist movement play out within the brigade, as do tensions between the various nationalities and between the political left and right. There are also tensions between the Jewish and non-Jewish members of the brigade's personnel. But why are there non-Jews in the Jewish brigade? Well, 3,200 Jews is still well short of the 5,000 needed for a unit of brigade strength. The British solved the problem by including around 1,000 non-Jewish specialists, such as artillerymen and ambulance drivers. But this isn't just the solution to the numbers problem. Whether for plain old anti-Semitic reasons or because of the political situation, the British believed that Palestinian Jews cannot be trusted with more military sensitive tasks. Hence, the radio operators must be British, as are many of the officers. After being assembled at the training camp of Burj el Arab, not far from the battlefield of El Alamein, the soldiers of the Jewish Brigade are dispatched to Italy on November 5th, 1944. They are not ready to fight the Germans, far from it. They need training, and much of it, and intensive training they receive for 4 months in Fiuggi, a famous thermal resort 80 kilometers southeast of Rome. After their training, the baptism of fire for the Jewish Brigade comes in early March 1945. As I said, they reach the front line on March 5th, where they adopt positions along the Lamone River in Romagna, southwest of Bologna. Here they are arranged against Austrians of the 42nd Jäger Division. First contact comes the next day when the Austrians launch a barrage of mortars at the Jewish Brigade. In the following days, the Jewish Brigade carry out some patrols and engage in small local engagements. They're keen to go into battle properly, and intelligence is reporting that the morale of the Jäger Division is low, and their commitment to Nazi ideals is waning. But the British hold the brigade back. Why the caution? Well, the British doubt the ability of the brigade and aren't willing to hand the Nazis the propaganda victory of defeating a Jewish unit in battle. Eventually, the Jewish Brigade do face off against the enemy. That will come next month during Operation Sonia. The action commences on the night of April 9, 1945. Company D, 2nd Battalion, covertly crosses the river Senio and seizes the strategically important Fantaguzzi mill without firing a single shot. Realizing they've been outwitted, the enemy lets rip with machine gun fire. Unfortunately for the Jewish Brigade soldiers, their adversaries are not the dispirited Austrians, but determined German paratroopers. But the Jewish soldiers are equally resolute, and meter by meter they advance, pushing the Germans back and liberating the village of Cofiano. They then face Mount Gebio, more like a small hill. But the Germans have mined the area extensively and entrenched themselves atop it. Orders are orders, though, and the Jewish Brigade attacks, successfully capturing Mount Gebio after 2 days of intense fighting. The Germans go into full retreat. When the brigade reaches the outskirts of Imola, they are ordered to stop, having taken 50 killed in action since March 5th. After their success on the battlefield, the British officers must acknowledge that the Jewish Brigade has fought well. With that, the war is over for the Jewish Brigade, though. But another chapter of their history begins as the men diverge paths, some to become angels and some to become avengers. Back in 1944, Churchill had wanted the Jewish Brigade to take a role in the occupation of Germany. But after the fighting in Italy, concerns soon arise in the 8th Army headquarters that the brigade soldiers might seek revenge on the Nazis. There have already been some episodes of harsh treatment of German prisoners. Nothing too serious, but enough to convince the High Command that sending the Jewish soldiers to Germany isn't a good idea. The brigade is instead stationed in Tarvisio, near the Italy-Austria border. This turns out to be a very lucky circumstance for them. Many Jewish refugees and former concentration camp survivors are heading to Italy, hoping to somehow make their way to Palestine, with a significant portion passing right through Tarvisio. The soldiers play a vital role in setting up refugee camps. They support and feed the refugees, often by stealing supplies from the British Army depots. But the men of the Jewish Brigade aren't there just to help their people recover from the horrors of war and genocide. The refugee camps provide a ready supply of people to build the Jewish homeland in Palestine. In defiance of British authorities, they acquire ships, load them with refugees, and dispatch them on a treacherous journey across the Mediterranean. Most of the ships are intercepted by the Royal Navy, but some manage to disembark on the Palestinian shores. Other men of the brigade devote themselves to a darker activity, dispensing rough justice against the perpetrators of the Holocaust. Until recently, little or nothing was known about this. There is no documentation except for the testimonies of those who carried out such killings. The historian Gianluca Fantoni did the research and cooperated on the writing for this episode and is one of the world's leading experts on the Jewish Brigade. He has dedicated himself to piecing together the truth. According to the testimonies, a typical operation proceeds as such. They enter a village, abduct a local Nazi, and compel him to identify his fellow Nazis living in the area as a condition for sparing his life. They then typically execute both the informant and the reported individuals. These actions are carried out covertly, with the bodies buried in some remote locations and all evidence meticulously erased. Many of the brigade are fluent in German, some are German and Austrian Jews. Their British uniforms greatly aid them. It is easy to fabricate service orders to justify their movements, allowing them to pass through the various checkpoints in the Austrian countryside and beyond. We don't know for sure how many Nazis the men of the brigade kill after the war. Various figures are given ranging from tens to hundreds. Some even go as high as 1,500. Some participants mention just a few squads of men. Others claim that there are dozens of them, each numbering 5 or 6 Avengers. As to the killings, some claim that thorough investigations are carried out to ascertain a target's guilt. Others have no recollection of such detailed investigations. Some mention a formulaic recitation spoken upon execution, something along the lines of, "In the name of the Jewish people, we execute you for crimes against our brothers." According to some testimonies, some of the Avengers end up murdering German civilians too, particularly when they can't find Nazis to execute. It's hardly surprising that all these accounts vary so much. Human memory is prone to errors, and reconstructing dramatic events long past often involves imagining facts that never occurred or framing events to justify the actions taken. While the Jewish Avengers continue to wipe out their enemies, the refugee smuggling operation goes on and starts to attract more attention. The brigade becomes a magnet for Jewish survivors in camps and ghettos across Europe who continue to be ferried across the sea to Palestine. Eventually, the British decide to put a stop to this by moving the brigade across Europe to Belgium and the Netherlands. But even then, the brigade continues to smuggle refugees. They also start to smuggle weapons to Palestine, as conflict with the Arabs looks to be inevitable. In the end, the British decide that the only way to quell the insubordination is to disband the brigade and send the soldiers back to Palestine. This happens in 1946, but as you might expect, that does not end the story. The men in Palestine continue fighting to bring about a Jewish state. Some join the terror group Irgun and carry out deadly bombings against British targets. Virtually all of the Jewish Brigade soldiers will go on to fight in the Arab-Israeli War in 1948, and as many as 35 of them become generals in the Israeli Defense Force. The Jewish Brigade will be memorialized in Israel, and among the modern Jewish community, a new historiography will hold the brigade up as a central counter-argument to the idea that the Jews were passive victims of the Holocaust, that they were brought as lambs to the slaughter. When the Arab-Israeli War ends in 1949, the men of the Jewish Brigade will have achieved their lifelong objectives. Israel stands as an independent nation, and the Arab League's attempt to destroy the fledgling state has failed. Of course, the creation of the new state is also accompanied by the expulsion of some 750,000 Arabs. It is by far not the first, but arguably the most violent period of fighting in the long-running ethnic, religious, and secular conflict in the region. That's a conflict that will continue running into the 21st century, and I'd encourage you to watch our video looking at the origins all the way back to the 11th century. It will be right here any moment now. We are able to cover these lesser-known but vital parts of human history because of the participation of the members of our community, the Time Ghost Army. As you can see from the contributions by Gianluca Fantoni to this episode, the Time Ghost Army is far more than a fan club. Together, we are an interactive force to spread factual knowledge of our ancestors' mistakes and successes from all of humanity's perspective, without any party, political, national, or special interest slant. so that we can all learn from the past to build a better future. Join us at timegoes.tv or patreon.com to be part of our effort to never forget.